Okay, so perhaps we should start. Hello and welcome to another episode, a very special episode of the Express Economist. I have with me Professor Ravi Srivastava, who's the director for Center for Employment Studies at the Institute of Human Development, and somebody I've gone back to for several years now to understand India's employment trends and what needs to be done in terms of policy to improve employment in India. And today's focus is to look at what is happening to employment in India and see where does the budget fit in, and how much does it move the needle forward in terms of employment. As people join in, this is a live session. This is the first live session we are doing, and we are hoping that if you have queries, please ask Professor Srivastav. And let me just give a brief overview of how I saw the I think somebody is not mute, but anyway. So let me just first give you a brief overview of how I saw the budget. In the reportage that we did at the Indian Express, you must have read stories about how we sort of looked at the budget, and there were three big takeaways from this year's budget. One was obviously the fiscal deficit routine was maintained, the glide path that government would reduce its borrowings as a percentage of GDP was maintained, and that was seen as a great thing. The second thing was that government decided further to increase the capital expenditure in its budget, and that was again also seen as a great thing because that creates opportunities for jobs, pushes growth forward, and there's been a substantial increase in capital expenditure. And the third big thing was the bit on the new tax regime, income tax regime, which has now been made default, and there are expectations that perhaps that would release a certain amount of consumer spending, and then start a virtuous cycle of growth where private sector finds it viable to sort of invest new capacities, create again more jobs and more prosperity that way. So that's broadly the three big things of the budget. And there's, broadly speaking, most people who track the macroeconomy, growth, fiscal numbers have found that to be a very reasonable strategy. And that is something that the government has done even right through the COVID period, when I think most governments have found it terribly difficult. Uh, Let me just ask my team to maybe somebody is not mute. Can you mute everybody? The video. Uh, we'll just wait for everybody to make it clean. Yeah. So, so that was a broad thrust. Now, but one of the things that we've noticed in the past few years, where from 2017-18 onwards, there was this data which showed that unemployment in India had risen to historic highs, 4-decade highs. But even otherwise, we found that India's growth process, while India has been growing fast in many years, it hasn't always created the jobs that it wanted. And there is a significant labor market stress. And this has to be addressed because we need to figure out, because we are a country which has lots of young people, and this is something that will remain a policy concern. And for a while, it appeared as if the government or people in the policy making circle didn't want to address this. But I think last year there was a lot of noise, even coming from places like RSS, about the concern in terms of unemployment. So let me first ask Professor Ravi Srivastava about, to give us a context of the labor market in India. Unlike the US, which is going through historic inflation, but it is also at historically low unemployment levels, which is a great thing because there are, everybody is fully employed. In India, the stress is much more. So, can you first, sir, give us a context for our viewers to sort of understand what is happening to the labor market? Because the economic survey was very sanguine about the labor market. It said that unemployment is down and employment is hitting new heights. A lot of happy news there that they gave, but doesn't always tally with all the notions that we see otherwise. So, give us a broader context of what's happening? I think you're on mute, sir.
Thanks, Udit, and thanks for inviting me to this session. As you rightly said, the economic survey points gives a very sanguine picture of the employment scenario in the country. And naturally, the budget, although the budget need not be completely in sync with the economic survey, these are basically parallel exercises. But the budget also gives a very, very sanguine picture of the employment scenario. So if you look at the economic scenario, it has a decent analysis of employment in recent years. It looks at employment in the pre-COVID year, and then it looks at employment over the last 2 years using the periodic labor force survey. It points out that as far as rural unemployment rates were concerned, they had revived in 2021. That the urban unemployment rates have revived in 22, the pre-COVID levels. It also says that there is an extent of it uses the EPFO data to point out that formal jobs are being created in the economy. This is a highly questionable fact, but nonetheless, this is what it does. It uses the EPFO data to talk about formal job creation, and then it also uses and it similarly uses the enterprise data to the survey, which we have now 4 rounds, to argue that the organized sector jobs have been growing in health, in education, in IT, particularly these three sectors. And then it finally looks at the annual survey of industries, and it points out that basically jobs are there is a scaling up of production. So more jobs are being created in larger factories employing 100 or more workers. So that these four indicators is what the economic survey focuses on, and on the basis of these four indicators, it says that the broader story, as you know, in the economic survey is that basically we are now in the post-recovery phase.
Yeah.
And so it also uses the data on employment or unemployment to point out that we are in the post-recovery phase. So I want to just talk a little bit about the unemployment scenario in this country and the labor market scenario. A few facts here, and maybe more will come up on the basis of your questions and other things. Some you've already given an indication to. The first broad fact is that over the last 2 decades, and I'm going to initially restrict myself to the period up to 2018-19. And the reason for that is that the periodic labor force surveys of 1920 and 2021 raise as many questions as they answer. Okay. So, and there is something to be said for the credibility of many of the facts, empirical facts, which the PLFS raises for these 2 years for a variety of reasons. So, I'm going to restrict myself to the normal years, so-called normal years, and the pre-COVID years. There's enough evidence to show that if you look at, for example, if you look at 2 decades data, roughly 2 decades data from 99,000 to 2018-19, that the creation of jobs has lagged behind uh, the expansion in the labor force. And that in turn has lagged behind the growth in population in the active, in the employable segment, let's say 15 to 59 or 15 to 64 years. And this holds even if you account for the fact that a large number of young people are joining education or are in education. So, in other words, even if you take that segment out, what you find is that jobs have not grown to the extent that the population in the segment 15 to 59 years has grown. So that's one thing. And secondly, of course, the gap between the two has increased over the years. As you already pointed out, this gap increased very significantly between 2004, 5, and 17, 18, when unemployment figures peaked. So that is something which means, so basically the economy is not creating enough jobs. And here, this question, as you rightly said, needs to be dissociated from the growth question. Growth or not, the kind of growth that we've been having has not been giving us enough jobs. Right? Growth is of a nature that jobs are not being created. That's the first question. The second, I think, important question is that the jobs that are being created are not of requisite quality. So they don't give people a decent standard of living. The wages are too low, working conditions are bad. If you look at safety, if you look at people's rights at work, and multiple other things, then you find that the working conditions of the working people in India are pretty bad. And as has been repeated times, many times over, 90% of our workforce is informal, in the sense that the ILO describes informality. That is, only 10% of the workforce has any access to formal social security measures. Okay. And even less, about 8 to 9% have any kind of written job contracts. Okay. So basically, there is a great deal of job insecurity in the workforce, and the lack of formality is there. These are two basic features. Now, on this, we need to superimpose two other things. One is that over a period of time, the the educational attainment of the workforce is growing, and this is particularly true of young people who are in the age group 15 to 29 years. Now, as educational attainment increases, it's only natural that young people aspire for decent jobs. But these decent jobs are not there in the economy. There are not enough decent jobs in the economy. So, what has happened is that youth unemployment rates, particularly among the educated unemployment, have been spiraling. Till 2011-12, the youth unemployment rates in India were well below the global levels. But by 2018-19, we had not only caught up with the global levels, but we had surpassed the global levels. So 19%, more than 19% of young people who had post-secondary education were unemployed. And this percentage was much higher for those who were graduates and above. And this unemployment figures not only for people who came from general education streams. There are high rates of unemployment even among technically educated young people, among people who have been formally trained, skilled, who've acquired skills formally and so on. Now, this is amazing that among graduates, that some segments of graduates in India, that a third among them are unemployed. They're seeking jobs which they're not able to get. And this is a combination of two facts. One, that they're not able to get enough decent jobs, not enough decent jobs are being created in the economy, and that most jobs that are being still created are really, only 13% of the jobs which young people have are highly skilled jobs. So most of the jobs are medium skilled jobs or low skilled jobs or unskilled jobs. Okay. So how do you exactly create an economy? I mean, how do you look at job expansion in a way that young people who are coming with some degree of education and now increasingly a high level of education, a third or more have now post-secondary levels of education, that they absorbed in the workforce and they can contribute productively. And the final issue is really of not only of young people, but women at large, but particularly young people among women, young women. So the unemployment rate, the labor force participation rate among young women has been going down systematically for almost over a quarter of a decade. Already, India's workforce participation rate, I mean, the economic survey makes a point about measurement of work. And I think that's a very valid point. Many of us have made the point that women's work needs to be looked at very differently. Women work at home, they contribute to the economy, and so on and so forth. But actually, the fact of the matter is that we need also to focus on women's paid employment, women who are in paid employment. And the percentage of women who are in paid employment in India is abysmally low. India ranks among a few South Asian countries and countries in the Middle East and North African region which have the lowest labor force participation rate among women and which has been declining over the period of time. But this decline is primarily has been concentrated in the rural areas where employment opportunities are declining, because of rising cost of fuel and fodder. It's becoming more and more difficult to keep livestock. Women are being driven also mostly out of agriculture. So it's becoming more difficult, and women cannot move with the same speed from rural areas to urban areas to find jobs. They cannot migrate. There are patriarchal constraints. There are social constraints. So that's one of the reasons why an increasing number of women are discouraged from taking up work. It is phenomenal if you note that actually nearly half the women from 93, 94 to up to the present period, you know, the women who are not in education, employment, or training, or young women, almost half the women are in this category. They're not in education, they're not employment, and not in employment, and they're not acquiring skill training. So they basically, discouraged workers, contributing a little bit to domestic economy, to domestic household, to care work, and so on and so forth. But their contribution needs to be more visible. And which is one of the reasons why our labor force participation rate overall, men and women taken together, is again one of the lowest in the world. Okay. So no, the problem here is that the essential problem is not only of that first of all we have not been able to expand employment opportunities fast enough, and we're not. Secondly, more important, we've not been able to expand decent employment opportunities for men and women, particularly young men and women. So we need to have a strategy in place which can do that. The final point I want to make, Udit, is that the world is facing rapid technological change, right? I mean, we talk about automation, we talk about digitization. Automation and digitization affect essentially automation affects basically low skill jobs. Uh, Digitization and automation affects medium skill jobs, clerical jobs, sales jobs. It's like, those kind of jobs are supposed to be affected. But of course, increasingly we have Chat GPT and AI, which could actually also replace high end jobs, high skill jobs. Okay. So the question is, if the global scenario is moving in a particular direction, that we need to engage with it. Where can jobs be created? Where can decent jobs be created? In what ways can jobs be created? And any rendering, any reading of the economic survey and of the budget, I've read it as carefully as I could read it, doesn't give me a sense that the economic survey has actually cottoned on to these problems. Right? I mean, as you said, it's a Blair's account of the fact that we are on the pre-COVID trajectory of recovery, not noting that the pre-COVID scenario, as far as employment was concerned, was extremely dismal in India already. So this is something which we need to factor in when we think about the budget.
Right. Thanks a lot for that opening statement. I just want to reiterate a couple of things that you mentioned. The concern that you showed that in about 2011-12, you said that our youth unemployment levels were lower than global levels. But since then, by 2018-19 or thereabout, youth unemployment levels were much higher than global levels. That is one big area of concern. That we are not creating enough jobs is one thing. That we are also not creating enough decent jobs. As education improves, a lot of kids who've got good education, they want decent jobs, they want a certain lifestyle, and those jobs that can provide that lifestyle are not there. And then there's a big question of women employment or the paid employment for women, that again is sort of holding India back in many ways. Many of the experts that we talk to repeatedly mention about the role of women in India's economy, and that essentially that is the demographic dividend that everybody keeps talking about. Until that happens, they enter the workforce, all the notions of demographic dividends perhaps may not materialize. Now, and you've also mentioned something called discouraged workers, and I would like you to sort of expand that a bit. The discouraged workers, because often this is less appreciated as a concept. What is this discouraged workers? Because it seems like there are many discouraged workers. I mean, running into millions. So let me ask a couple, and then the threat of automation, which not only is likely to take away low skilled jobs, but also can threaten high skilled jobs. And something that in one of the previous sessions we were talking to Professor Hajun Chang, he was saying that India has a surplus on service exports, and we are very gung ho about that we can provide services to the rest of the world, we can be the back office to the rest of the world. But he said that a lot of this automation will take away that surplus, perhaps. So you already have a deficit on merchandise exports, and you may not, which is too big for services to compensate. You might actually have automation take that away, that little surplus also. So there are massive concerns here. One thing that I wanted to first just ask you to elaborate is this discouraged worker thing, because the labor force participation rate going down. If you could just explain this, I think this is very important for a lot of, especially for young viewers to watch and understand, and for general public also to understand that there is one thing called the unemployment rate, but that doesn't always capture the stress in the labor market in India, primarily because the labor force participation rate is coming down. If you could just elaborate this salient point first, this is because often we look at unemployment rates. You'll have chief ministers and politicians saying, "Hamari state mein to 2% hai, 4% hai." But when you go down to the number of employment rate or worker participation, that's fairly abysmal. So can you just elaborate that, and then we'll move on to the budget?
Yeah. So essentially, when we measure unemployment rate, the first thing we're looking at whether people who are actively seeking employment, or everyone who's either in the labor force or is actively seeking employment is part of the labor or is in the labor force, is treated to be, I mean, all those who are in the workforce or are actively seeking employment are considered to be part of the labor force. Right. Now, if you're not actively seeking work, then you're not part of the labor force. And then when we measure unemployment, we look at the number of people who are actively seeking work and not getting it, divided by the total labor force. Okay, so there is no room here. Although now the ILO has expounded in one of in its redefinition of work and employment, has talked of an augmented figure where we can take account of some of these factors, but essentially people who are discouraged from seeking work, young women, for example, who know that there is no point in repeating a daily experience day after day if they're not going to get the work near their homes or the conditions, so they drop out of the workforce. Sorry, they drop out of the labor force. So they are essentially the discouraged workers. And if you go out and talk to young women, for example, in rural areas and so on and so forth, and if you ask probing questions, then they will of course tell you that they would be willing to work if there's suitable work, closer to their homes, in which they can combine, both productive and reproductive skills. In other words, they can take care of their children, they can take care of their families, and yet do productive and paid work. They would be happy to do it. But since most of the time such work is not available to them, they drop out of the labor force altogether. So these are basically the discouraged workers.
Okay. Um, so we are getting more questions from the viewers, and that's great. And I would request you, if you have questions, this is a live session. Please send in your queries, and we'll get them answered right now. And it's a great opportunity for you to listen in real time your answers from Professor Srivastava. We have a couple of questions. One from Kartikeya Gupta. Let's take one or two questions, and then we'll move along the discussion. And this is a very interesting question because a lot of people ask this. Kartikeya Gupta is asking, is the reason for unemployment in India due to the rising disposable income in the middle class families, that they can sustain their sons and daughters to prepare for government jobs? This is a very interesting thing because a lot of people have this notion that
Absolutely. So this is something. This notion is very widespread, right? Even in economics, we say that basically, it's often stated, economists state that people who are well off can stay out of the workforce for a much longer period, can afford to be unemployed till they get a suitable job. There's no doubt that there is a question of let's say a reservation job which people have in mind, right? If you have studied up to, let's say, if you're a graduate, right, you will resist joining the labor market on very onerous conditions which don't pay you enough and so on. But this does not mean that you have actually the wherewithal to stay out of the workforce for a very long period of time. Uh, Let me just give you two data points to as counterfactuals to this. First, between 2011-12 and 18-19 or 17-18, whichever we wanted, uh, the unemployment level increased for all income quintile groups. In other words, if you look at the bottom 20% in terms of uh, per capita income or per capita expenditure, or you look at the top this thing, the unemployment rate increased for all of them. Similarly, if you look at education levels, the unemployment level increase rates increase for those who had no education, to those who had, let's say, primary or secondary middle level of education, to those who had secondary level of education, to those who had graduate levels of education. So whether you were poor or non-poor, there were not enough jobs to fall into your lap. You couldn't. There were just not enough jobs for you to take. Okay. So and finally, let me give you a very interesting fact that, for example, graduates and above, right? It's true that a lot of graduates still are from the upper quintiles, right? They are better off, from the better off sections of society. But for example, if you look at how are the poor households who have a graduate kid, okay, what is the unemployment rate for those graduate kids, boys and girls, compared to the unemployment rate for those boys and girls who are from richer households? Basically, what you find is that educated young people from poorer households have literally a 50 percent point more higher unemployment rate compared to young people from higher quintiles, better off households. So it's just not a question of that they wanted to stay out of the labor force. It's also that there are not enough jobs. Of course, there is a combination of factors. The combination of factors is they would like to do decent jobs. Maybe there is a question of quality of education also. Maybe it is a question of social capital and connections. Poorer people tend to be more unemployed even with education because they don't have the right kind of connections, the right kind of background. But at the end of the day, there are just not enough jobs for people who are educated from whichever class they come from. And the lower class, the poorer you are, the more likely you are to be unemployed.
Okay. There's, we're getting questions thick and fast. Varna Sriram is asking, I'd love to hear from you about the lack of good data and the lack of a census and how that makes poor policy and for poor budgeting planning. How lack of data and lack of census makes for poor policy and poor budgetary planning. That's an important question considering that we are so far behind on our latest census. How does it affect?
Yeah, I mean, frankly, I wish all of us, academics, policymakers, would initiate a debate on data and on credible data. I'm sure that all the participants here would be aware of that enormous magnitude of migration crisis which occurred during 2020, where we saw the largest numbers of people, I think, for any, the largest global episode of people reverse migrating from urban to rural areas. Mainly circular migrants and permanent migrants and so on and so forth. And then a cry went up that we needed more data. The government said we don't have more data. Of course, we had enough signals. We could make estimates of the number of migrants and so on. But yet, of course, the need for more data was felt. But I don't know how many of you are aware that even for the 2011 census, not all the detailed migration tables were ever published. They've just not been published. And then, given the urgency, we would have hoped that the 21 census would be on time, would give us detailed figures of population, of migration, of the nature of employment. That also has not happened. Now, COVID has struck a blow to the quality of data and to the credibility of data. Uh, if you the two main data sources that we have for employment, first the the national the NSO data, the periodic labor force surveys, and then we have the private data source, the CMI. Now these are conceptually different. Empirically, they do different things. They're not strictly comparable. Okay. The PLFS is what the government has made its position very clear. Till some time ago, government officials, ministers used to quote both the CMIE and the PLFS data depending on convenience and suitability. But the government has now come down very clearly to say that we only adhere to the official data source, which is the PLFS. Now, as I said, the PLFS and the NSSO has one of the highest, has a very high credibility globally in the way data is collected and in the way data is disseminated. But the data for 2021, 1920, and 2021 on employment leave a lot to be desired. And also timely data. For example, we are currently in January, February 2023, but the data for 21, 22 is still not been released. Although all the quarterly data is there with us, but it has not been released. If you look at 2019, 20, and 2021, 1920, as we know, the last trimester of 1920 was a complete lockdown. 2021, we had patchy lockdowns throughout the country. It ended with the April to June, the massive second COVID wave, where there were localized lockdowns. And we know that all of these did affect economic activity, right? Now, if you look at the PLFS data, although it gives us some sense of the kind of distress employment that was being created, people taking up low value work, wages not rising, self-employed earnings going down, agricultural employment showing a bulge and all that. But on the other hand, it's still, if you look at, for example, this was a period when there was very low growth, negative growth in many sectors. But even in the period there was negative growth in many sectors, the PLFS still shows employment is expanding quite significantly, right? Now, this is something which has to be squared up. Why is it that the economy and employment were showing such different signs? How does the PLFS data come up with this? So I think the issue of data and maintaining the credibility of institutions like the NSSO and the quality of data that we have is extremely important, because unless we have that, we will not be able to make correct policy. Right? I mean, the PLFS, forget about the quality of employment, because a lot of this was very poor quality of employment. But the PLFS actually says that between 2018-19 and 2021, something like 69 million jobs were created. Two-thirds of them were poor quality jobs in rural areas, agriculture, own account work, and so on. But at the same time, there was some expansion of jobs in manufacturing, regular jobs, etc., etc. Where did all these jobs come from? Still, you know, even if you have distress employment, people need something to work on, something to work with. How did you get this vast bulk? It was only Manrega. Was it only Manrega? Where did it come from? So I think we need a lot. We need to ask a lot more questions of the data that we have, so that we have credible data guiding policy. And that is why the economic survey restricted itself to the PLFS data from 1819, 1920, 2021. And I said, look, I will deal with the long-term trend up to 1819, and I will deal with the COVID years if needed, and if there are specific questions, differently.
Right. So a couple of things that you mentioned are the jobs for women, the distress jobs, and Manrega. We have a few questions on something similar. Shalini Kala is asking, how does one categorize those who are forced to take what is available but pays very low or is very hazardous? For instance, women rolling BD in some of the remote rural areas in India. So how are they categorized? She wants to
know. Well, as I said, our economy continues to generate a large number of very low quality jobs. And when I say low quality, I only don't mean in terms of earnings. I mean in conditions of work, I mean in terms of lack of social security of any kind, conditions under which people can negotiate for better work, etc. There is a large number of workers who are lacking safety issues. BD workers are typically exposed to a lot of tobacco fumes. It's a very unsafe area of work, the conditions under which they work. But there are vast areas of the economy. The PLFS itself actually points out that a lot of people work up to 11 hours a day. So the average working hours are very long, safety conditions are very poor, remuneration is very low, and that is why I said that the quality of jobs leaves much to be desired. And if one has to look at the budget, one also needs to look at what it did in order to improve the quality of jobs. Maybe I don't think very large resources are needed to look at safety conditions in jobs, but was enough done in the budget, this budget or any other budget?
Right. So, I mean, there was one question that I wanted to ask you about the whole capex push. But let me and somebody has also asked about the Narega allocations being cut down. So let me first take the Narega allocation because that's related to the budget. Pankaj Anand has asked if government claims that increase in capex will lead to more jobs, isn't it ironical to reduce allocation for Manrega by over 17%? What's the logic? Um, how do you sort of see that cut in allocation for Manrega? Because the government has clarified that it's a demand driven program, and so we can always increase it as it perhaps does every year. But how do you see that?
So essentially, I think at one point the economic survey itself clarifies that the amount spent in Manrega creates assets, right? So essentially, it is something because it creates assets. Essentially, it is a low gestation capex program, in my view, right? It creates public works, it creates roads, it creates ponds, it creates so many things, wells in the rural areas. So from that point of view, it really creates jobs and it creates assets, and it's that perspective now. As I'm sure there is debate, of course. There is a view which says that it's like helicopter money, but a lot of us would argue that the Manrega Act was a historic act. The legislation was historic because what it said was that anyone needing unskilled work in the rural areas, and of course, we now want to extend the ambit, and we've talked about urban areas in other contexts. The commission of which I was a part, NCU, has talked about an urban Manrega and so on. But essentially, when you if it was a historic act for anyone who wanted unskilled work would go up and demand work, and work had to be provided within 5 kilometers of the person. And then there were accountability mechanisms which were worked into the system and so on and so forth. And people have fought for this over a long period of time. But what has happened is that the government keeps on saying that this is a demand based, this is a demand, but this is not the way it works out on the ground. On the ground, uh, the Manrega works like the government putting off and on a tap. So as and when it wants, it opens the tap, and it opens the tap to the extent that it wants to open the tap. It could be a trickle or it could be more than the trickle. And it's only when it opens the tap that people are encouraged to line up for the water. Okay. So because other than that, demands are not registered. Applications for unemployment are rarely ever registered. And the sad part of it is that even when work is allotted, wages are not paid in full. So the idea, one can keep on repeating that it is demand based, so allocation will increase, and what is the point? But the fact is that the labor plans which are submitted, are curtailed or cut back because there is not enough allocation. When work start, because there is not enough allocation, so wages are not paid on a timely basis. So it's a heavily rationed scheme, and it has over time. So if anyone who has visited the rural areas, in the last, it started in 2005, last 15 years, 17 years, can vouch for the fact that large percentage of basic rural assets, road, connectivity, wells, ponds, water harvesting structures have been created out of Manrega funds. So I think the cutback in Manrega funds really hits people not only at the bottom of the pyramid, but also hits a scheme which can create public assets at very low cost and immediately provide the possibility of giving employment to people who need it.
Right. I have a few more questions, but let me remind the viewers, please send us your questions. You can send it on YouTube or Twitter. We'll monitor it. And I want to take advantage of my position and ask a specific question before I take up some of the viewers' questions. So this question of Narega, creating assets, can the government not, I'm just giving a counter argument. I'm just asking you that can the counter argument not be that we have increased PM Awas allocation and we don't need Narega, or we don't need to depend on Narega if actually we are doing it through a proper scheme? They will create jobs, they will create a virtuous cycle. And that's why we've cut Narega, because we believe that that same person would actually be working on the PM Awas scheme. So we won't need it. Would that be? I mean, if it's capex, then it's capex. Why can't they do it under the other scheme? And that's a more proper way of doing it. And Narega is just a dole out kind.
So Udit, this is a fictitious argument. And why is it a fictitious argument? Because for the past, I think, 10 plus years, government has been aiming on convergence between Manrega and other asset building schemes in rural areas. So, for example, you give the example of the Awas Yojana, right? In the Awas Yojana, the beneficiary can take up 90 days or 100 days of work as a beneficiary of Manrega and put in that kind of work and be paid for it, right? So he's building his old home, but he's employed in building his home and he's getting paid for it. Okay, so you have assets, but at the same time, those assets, there is a demand-based schemes which also ensures that the person gets work when he needs it and builds the asset as per the government priority requirement. So whether it is cattle sheds or whether it is goat pens or whether it is rural housing or whether it is rural toilets uh, and many other schemes, even rural roads and so on, have a component in which you can converge these schemes with Manrega. And by converging these schemes with Manrega, you can do both. You can have a demand-based entitlement and yet build assets. So the capital requirement is taken care of in the other scheme, and the labor demand and the wages are primarily because there's a ceiling on the capital requirement as far as Manrega is concerned. But here you can dovetail both. So the dovetailing has been happening over a number of years. So that is why this argument is fictitious. And it's been happening precisely in the argument which the government gave. I mean, one of the spokesperson gave, for example, on television I heard, which is in relation to the Prime Minister Awas Yojana. It's precisely in that we have been dovetailing resources. So, right. I mean, if you can have an ideal mix of a demand-based scheme and at the same time a scheme which can create durable assets, why not have that?
Right. Let me take a question from somebody who calls himself Newton. He's asking, and perhaps as much as it is a question, it is reflecting the stress that we keep talking about in the labor market. He's saying, sir, I'm a mechanical engineer. He finished with the studies in 2021, although he puts in bracket that not from IIT. I don't have a job because there are no companies in my college for mechanical branch, and many of my friends went to software company. So what is the government doing? So I think this is also about perhaps the choice of what you study and where the jobs are. That makes not that thing not being aligned. Maybe questions of streamlining that thing. What I mean, he's asking what the government is doing. I don't know what you have to say on that, and also on the larger question of whether there has to be streamlining over what is the demand and what are we teaching.
Yeah, so these mismatches which occur, for example, more people being trained in mechanical engineering, but there being fewer jobs in mechanical engineering versus software or computer science. This is definitely there, and this is something which is essentially there can be two ways in which this can be bridged. This can be bridged, and this is bridged actually in a large this thing. This is one area where private sector has come in to skill its own workforce. So, because there is a shortage in software development, has been a shortage over a period of time, many software companies will take young people on board with a mechanical engineering degree or an electrical engineering degree, and then will put them through a period where they are trained with computer science because they have the basic wherewithal, and then will give them a software development job or some other job in the IT sector, right? Uh, the other way it can be done is that the government steps in and provides the requisite amount of training. Right. And the government has, of course, a large number of schemes through which it provides training, but the government training modules are too short. Basically, they're not equipped well enough to be able to give the people the kind of training they require to take up reasonably high end jobs. So it's all right if you want to become a tailor, if it's all right if you want to become a mason, then you can do a 3 month or a 6 month training or whatever. But it's probably not all right if you want to become. So there is the question of basically the private sector needs to in India needs to invest far more in training than it does. The government keeps on saying that they are stakeholders. The private sector keeps on saying that you have to consult us. But the fact of the matter is that because of the kind of jobs the private sector creates, which are basically contractual jobs, short period jobs, and so on. And this is a classic problem. Economists have addressed this over a period of time. There is not enough incentive for the private sector to invest in people's training for a long period of time. Okay. But that is where you need to basically, this partnership should be in such a way that the private sector actually invests more in training. Instead of saying you've given us the wrong kind of people, take those people on. They have enough skills, they have enough education, they have cognitive skills, they have the right kind of skill, train them and make them do the kind of job that you want them to do. Sorry, you muted now.
Sorry, I would come back to the skilling question because even in the latest budget, there's been some reference to PM Vikas, which is the Vishwakarma Kaushal Samman. And we've heard a lot about, not just this government, even in the previous government, we've heard a lot about skilling as a country. There's been a lot of focus, at least in the talk. I don't know how much of it is actually reflected in the budget. I don't see allocations being high enough in that sense. And what can be done on skilling, but I'll come to that later. Let me just round off the Narega bit because one of the viewers is asking, Shalini is asking, what are the medium and long term fallouts do you see of the cut in Manrega budget? Um,
Yeah. So for one thing, I'm not so gung ho about the recovery pace in the economy, in the rural economy in particular. The government quotes that agriculture has been growing at a very high rate, but I don't think if you look at rural wages, for example, and economic survey itself makes the point that rural wages have been declining. Uh, we know about the earnings of farmers, cultivators, that is, that again has been, declining. If it not been for schemes like PM Kisan Samman, the farmers would have been actually much worse off than they would. But so basically, their incomes have not increased. The incomes of laborers have not increased, uh, and there is still a lot of stress in the rural economy. So this is where schemes like Manrega are designed to play a role. They're basically designed to take up this stress and to help to create. I mean, this is again I would say this is a unique job because not only does it provides incomes and wages, it also creates assets in the rural areas. So in my view, this is I think somewhere along the line this is counterproductive, uh, and I think the government should let Manrega pick up the slack in the rural economy and in rural jobs. In fact, it should think of extending Manrega along the lines which many people have been recommending to urban areas. It's a demand-based job. So if people don't require that job, they will not ask for it. They will not demand it. But as long as there is a demand for it, these jobs should be provided.
Let me ask this question here, because a lot of people have argued, and for several years now, that programs like Narega or Urban Narega, which at least some states have started now, there are two problems that they point out. One, they say that these programs will never go away, and two, they hold back the broader economy from sort of taking up the labor. There is this whole argument that people are happy just doing that. They don't do much more. Government is giving them free grains. They don't actually have to do more. So it's sort of holding back the Indian economy in a productive sense. What is your take on that notion?
So, as I pointed out, as far as Manrega is concerned, I'll go to the free grains issues later on. But as far as Manrega is concerned, it is not a dole scheme. It is a scheme in which people do very hard work, they're paid for it, and they create assets. I have personally, and many of us would have seen Manrega sites, the kind of work which people have to do, and at the end of the day, the injustice very often that they don't get paid the wages within the required period. Okay, so Manrega is not a scheme, which is not a dole scheme at all. And I don't think that it pulls down. There can be argument about how high or how where should the Manrega wages be pitched, right? Now, this has been an argument which has been in the literature for a very long time, right? Uh, it the Manrega wages should be pitched at, of course, a subsistence level, but at the same time, uh, if people get to migrate to other areas where they can get higher wages and better quality work, then they should be incentivized to do it. And which is why you see, you can see in many areas what happens, for example, in, let's say, Rajasthan or Kerala. It's basically a lot of young people migrate to urban areas, to construction work where wages are higher, they get better. It is basically women and people who cannot migrate who take up Manrega work. So they're able to combine care work, the domestic economy, and Manrega work in and around their households. So, it's as a household strategy, it works very well. But at the same time, it doesn't deter people from moving to other areas, to urban areas, to take up higher quality work, which can give them 7, 8 months of work, even under difficult conditions. So working with contractors, 11 hours, 12 hours is not easy, but at least it gives them a livelihood, right? So I think I don't think that Manrega work has, and there are, of course, a number of studies which show this, that Manrega work deters mobility of people to more productive sectors and to better work. Now, as far as the question of food is concerned, the food insecurity question is concerned, I think once again, uh, that the middle class should ask itself one question: what would it agree to get in order to stop working? Okay, I mean, what would be the reservation? Let's say transfer income at which it would stop working, and is the 25 kilos or 5 kilos per unit grain which people get. At the moment, they're getting it free thanks to recent decisions taken by government. But at the rates at which the NFSA fixed it, 2 rupees and 3 rupees, would it deter people from going out and working and bettering their condition? Would it pay for what would that, supposing there was an income transfer and all that money was given to them in cash? How many days of requirement would it take? Would it fill for them? So the argument that yes, yes, Manrega and the NFSA do, they do raise the reservation wages a little bit, but that is how labor market should work. Labor market should not allow people to work at 10 rupees a day, 20 rupees a day. So if you're firming up the bottom level of wages in the economy by providing people some degree of an alternative, that in itself is not a bad thing.
It is a safety net after it.
It's that kind of safety. But does it deter people from working? The answer is no, because neither of these two together provide people a minimum level of subsistence, even if you ask me.
Now, there are a couple of questions. Subhashish has asked on Twitter that, every day we are hearing some high positioned employee being terminated with immediate effect in many sectors. Is this only India specific or across the globe? So, your take. I mean, we keep hearing a lot of job losses across the world because of recessionary fears. Um, how would you want to respond to this? And yeah, let me just ask one more. Another question that has come is that because this is related, that over the last few years, several MNCs in auto, say banks, they have withdrawn from India or downsized. And this has added to the employment problem. Those opportunities have gone. So, has the budget done anything to repair this? So, how bad is it within India and across the world? And um, how has the budget done much?
Okay. So, can I give a generic answer to this and link it up with the first issue that you raised, which is about capex and spending and the kind
Yeah,
of skilling which the government provides, because we may not have enough time to deal
yeah,
specifically with some of these issues. You see, as a general strategy, as you rightly pointed out in the beginning, investing more in capital expenditure, capital formation by the government is a good strategy for two reasons. One is that it can have a multiplier effect. It can crowd it, basically, it can crowd it investment. And in the short run, while private investment is still kicking in, it can create some jobs, right? But the if this capex is concentrated in capital intensive sectors, then the immediate impact of capex on employment will be very limited. So if you look at the current composition of capex, yes, let's say the PMAY has a short gestation period. It'll create jobs. It'll create low skill jobs and other kinds of jobs. And yes, but other jobs are which capex will create will be fairly in very capital intensive sectors. The immediate implication for this for the economy will not be very high. Similarly, the budget has a great deal of focus, and in a sense, it is welcome. But I want to moderate it a little bit on basically Industry 4.0 technologies. Skilling also, we have tried to veer it towards Industry 4.0 technology, robotics, coding, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, the budget, if I may say so, displays a naive about overall job implications of what Industry 4.0 technologies will do. Right. So, what you need to do in a budget of this kind, and if you read the budget, there is extremely little about MSMEs.
yeah,
Incentive to no, we know it for a fact. We know it for a fact that MSMEs have been suffering for a long period of time. We know it for a fact that capital concentration has been increasing in the economy, that inequalities as a result of that in wealth creation have been increasing in the economy. So basically, what we needed to do was focus a great deal on small industries, which is basically the smaller end of the factory sector, and then the rest of the informal sector, and allowing them to scale up. Rather than to feel very happy about the fact that factories with you know more capital intensive factories are scaling up production, or that they're taking away a share of production from smaller units. Okay. So what the question here is that technological change is happening very rapidly. Uh, Firms made certain decisions during COVID. One of them was to expand IT and IT enabled services, move into edutech in a very large way, and so on and so forth. And now they are finding that the expansion in capacity which they undertook during those years was very high, leading to redundancies. And these redundancies are not only happening in India; were happening globally. Okay, so this kind of structural changes will happen to some extent, and maybe they're inevitable. But what we need to do is to strategically focus on areas and skills which will create jobs. Because so it's basically walking in two legs, right? As the economy transforms, uh, we we should focus our skill creation so that young people can take up the new kinds of jobs which are coming. But we should recognize that a lot of jobs are going to be uh, still middle skill, low skill jobs. And here we should create focus on creating those jobs which are more labor intensive, but creating better quality jobs. So focusing on social security, right? Focusing on working conditions, focusing on safety, hours of work, that will then enable people, young people, even if they have some level of education, to do those jobs. The budget has not taken that view. Look at social security, right? Expenditure on social security, there was a lot of anticipation that the government may increase expenditure on social security in the run up to the G20 and the elections and so on. That has not happened. In fact, allocation to social security has gone down in real terms and even in nominal terms. There is nothing about industrial safety, right? It requires very little investment to create, to make clear that, you talk about supply chains, but can we not talking about safety and supply chains? So those areas where you can have very high spin-off in terms of quality of work at very little investment. And the government talks about, basically create quality of work, quality of living. Uh, these are areas which should have, certainly in my view, been prioritized a great deal.
So this is a very important bit about how we grow. Viewers should understand, or perhaps would also know, that India can grow, GDP can grow, but GDP can come from very different sources. It can be a capital intensive process, it could be a labor intensive process, and the difference is how many people get the job. And we've seen most of the data shows that we've actually become our whole manufacturing and production process actually become more capital intensive. And so the same GDP can be created with fewer people, and that's perhaps adding to the job stress. And
Absolutely.
that's why the focus that you mentioned about labor intensive um, areas of work, even the PLI scheme, which is trying to incentivize production, but is it incentivizing labor intensive areas? There's been a question mark. Somebody had asked a question, they deleted it, but the question was valid, and so without naming the person, let me ask that question because it's an important one. They were asking whether do you think the government is doing enough to create jobs in agriculture related industries like food processing, cold storage, etc., because it has huge potential to solve the problem of disguised unemployment in farming activities. I think this is a fantastic question because it sort of hits very much goes to the heart of the matter.
Yeah. So, what the government has done in this budget is created a so-called accelerator fund, which is to encourage startups. And it has talked about creating producer companies of self-help groups, again, to bring benefits of scale to the large number of women self-help groups which are there around the country. I would say, and this is, we have the context of the farmers' agitation there. Also, when I say this, that the government, if it takes the alternative route, which is to hand over food processing and the cold chain, etc., to large corporate conglomerates, okay, that is one way of addressing it. The other way of addressing is to create capacity at the bottom of the ladder, basically to create producer associations, federations of self-help groups, and so on. So they scale up their activity and make sure that the benefits of value addition accrue to the cultivators and the farmers. I mean, with, we are the the Amul story is part of our history now, right? So basically, if we that is really the way to go about it, and if the government can do that, rather than think of large corporate conglomerates coming over and capturing value from agriculture in fairly capital intensive ways, then that would be, in my view, not a correct, strategically correct direction. But if it can actually encourage producers association and make sure that value is captured by the actual producers, then it may go a long way in adding to farmers' incomes.
Right. I think the gentleman whose question I asked has posted again. I hope Girdhari Lal Rahar had asked. I hope you were watching the live and perhaps got the answer. Otherwise, there'll be a recording of the show and you can catch your answer again. There's one more question, which is with the largest population country in the world, how is uh, how will Indian government be able to provide so many jobs? I think there. I think so. This is at the heart of the matter. What I sense is that people have. I was talking to somebody else who's in the private sector who also provides provides a link for rural workers to join urban jobs, and they said that people's expectation of jobs are only from the government. The private sector bit, they don't. They understand that they don't have any say in the private sector. So this question is also coming from that notion that what is the government doing for jobs? And somebody else on Twitter had replied yesterday when we were promoting the show, is that government's job is not to provide jobs. The budget was not supposed to provide jobs. It was just about an income statement or something like that. Stick to the pure fundamentals, and it's not your job to dole out jobs. Can you just speak a bit on what is the role of the government in terms of providing jobs or creating conditions for jobs? What can the
Sure.
government do?
No, it's absolutely correct. It's not the government job to directly, create jobs. The government job is to facilitate the creation of jobs in the economy through the correct policy mixes, through the correct kinds of policy instruments, through public investment, because public investment continues to play a very important role in a country like India. So, in that sense, the people are right. But why is it that we have a riot every time government jobs are advertised? Why is it that even, I mean, look at army recruitment centers, you look at railway recruitment, you look at recruitment, any public sector recruitment, you look at recruitment of teachers, policemen, and if somebody were to document public sector recruitments, particularly in the somewhat slower growing regions of India, why is it that conditions are so bad? The conditions are bad because there is no, first of all, there is no uptake as far as the private sector growth is concerned. Secondly, the kind of jobs that the private sector tends to provide, this thing, are basically the bulk of them are still low quality jobs. See, what is a fact is that even when you look at the formal sector of the economy, even with the measures for formalization, the government has taken measures to expand EPFO and ESIC, and they've given some dividends. More people are workers are enrolled with EPFO and ESIC today than they were earlier, which is a very good thing, right? But even if this is the case, uh, the fact is that a growing percentage of people in the organized sector of our economy are today informal workers. So while the number of formal workers in the organized sector is growing, the percentage of informal workers in the organized sector is also growing. So people are being recruited without any form of social security, without any job security. They're doing jobs at pittance in sales, in telemarketing, as teachers, and so on and so forth. So if that is the case, would they not be rational to aspire for public sector jobs which give them job security, which are better paying, and so on and so forth? If public sector creates better standard jobs, then I agree with the fact that if public sector provides jobs wherever they are, as school teachers and this thing, then the quality the public sector should be a standard bearer. Unfortunately, that is not what is happening, because actually the public sector jobs are getting also contractualized more and more. Maybe at a lower level, but they're also getting contractualized, they're also getting informalized. But essentially, it should be the job of the public sector to make sure that good quality employment is created, not only directly by it, but also in its supply chains. And that it is the policy instrument to ensure that as far as the private sector is concerned. So that's one thing. Second part, the population part, the fact of the matter is that even in countries where population is growing slowly, in sub-Saharan Africa and countries, you can have a very severe employment crisis. So it's not that the employment crisis has nothing to do with the fact that our population is growing at a certain level. And look at India, right? We have multiple Indias. So Maharashtra, look at Maharashtra, look at Gujarat, look at Tamil Nadu, look at Karnataka, look at Kerala. These are states where the demographic transition has happened. Some of them are below replacement levels of population. Jobs are growing quite rapidly in these areas, and they're actually attracting young people from Uttar Pradesh, from Bihar, from Jharkhand, from Odisha, from West Bengal, from Rajasthan to work in them. Fertility levels are also going down in Rajasthan, Odisha, UP, etc. Right? It's not that they're not going down; they're going down quite rapidly. But the unfortunate thing is that the, the growth, the jobs are not being created rapidly enough. If jobs are created rapidly enough, and if they're of decent quality, then people will avail of them. And I think that is entirely possible given that India has such a low labor force participation rate, as we pointed out. So much productive potential is being wasted in it.
Yeah. We are towards the end of the session. We'll have another 10-15 minutes max. So if you have a question, please ask. And I would like to also move towards some more solutions. We keep talking about what are the different ways in which this problem of unemployment is sort of exhibiting, and um, so one counter argument that somebody was making this point, and I want to ask this question, that over time we have, given the ideological position this government has had, or even broadly since 1991 that we've adopted as an economy, is that government's role in the economy would will be pulled back, and that means sanitation workers, or anything in the economy will be done through private channels. But there's a counter argument that people say that let private sector do a lot of other things which it can do more efficiently, but there's a lot of public services that the government can still provide. India is a large country. We need, say, sanitation workers. We need a lot of sanitation workers. Why can't that all be brought into the government's fold? Why can't that be done by the government? I mean, sort of expanding the government's role, or even on health and education. One of the people, experts we were talking to, said that for women specifically can work a lot in the health sector. So if you were to expand on that sector in the government arm, within the government fold, you can perhaps incentivize certain, serve two goals of providing employment, also providing to women. Can such a policy or such an approach work for us, especially with our kinds of demands where we?
So first of all, in a in an economy, we're a lower middle income economy as a present and growing. Uh, Hopefully, will continue to grow quite rapidly. Uh, in this kind of a context, there will still be a massive role for public services in health, in education, in many other spheres. Not just the classical police and law and order and security and army, but even in terms of development services, the public sector will have to play a fairly important role. Now, if the public sector withdraws prematurely from these roles, in whether it's in education or whether it is in health, then it will create a great deal of inequities. That's exactly what we are seeing in these spheres. We're seeing this in terms of access to quality health services. Of course, the government thinks insurance, maybe insurance services may reduce the inequity in terms of health services, but we're seeing it all the time. We're seeing it in education for the past 25, 30, or more than 3 decades, actually, close to 3.5 decades. We are seeing the impact of privatization. Then governments have moved in with vouchers and other kinds of systems to negate the effect of privatization. But the fact is that because of these systems, the inequities keep growing. And it is our duty, a constitutional obligation to provide basic services. Uh, as far as possible, wherever required, public services should be provided directly. Now, supposing they're not provided directly, then their provision has to be regulated. The terms and conditions under which they are provided, how they are provided, the government should step in and regulate the provision of these health and services. Right? I mean, education has to be either free or affordable. That is what the fundamental rights, the UN's fundamental charter says. So we should ensure that education is either free or affordable, right? For all sections of society. That's the only way we can create this channel. Health, we know the extraordinary amount of out of pocket expenditure which young people have to, yeah, which people of all walks of life have to say. I mean, the survey does make the point that out of pocket expenditure as a proportion of total expenditure has declined in as far as 17-18 is concerned, thanks to the push by insurance and other sectors. But the fact of the matter is it's still extraordinarily high, and a large number of people are pushed below the poverty line simply because of out of pocket health expenditure. And we've seen that during COVID. People had to sell homes in order to finance health expenditure. So these are areas where we do need. And if let's say sanitation, you have to point out now, sanitation services is not only that sanitation services have been outsourced, but you look at the quality of work that has been created in the sanitation sector. A generation ago, or maybe a generation and a half ago, in urban areas, the sanitation work provided at least, it provided a stepping stone for people from socially deprived groups to start earning a decent salary. And with job reservations and with education, in many cases, their children were able to move out of sanitation work and take up better quality work in the area. Now, what is happening? That the children of sanitation workers in the present scenario are doing contractual work, working with contractors under very unsafe conditions, under at very low wages. So there is no possibility of upward mobility as far as that is concerned. And this really requires a close look by government. This is why I said that one has to, but it takes very little to focus on quality of work. And the government has not been able to do that adequately.
Right. So we'll conclude with one last question that I wanted to ask was to, you know, we the budget has a broader strategy that, you know, the capex that they are doing, and uh, the push towards private sector, hoping that the private sector would start investing, and that would start a virtuous cycle and create jobs, which, although hasn't happened. An economic survey actually was sort of a tacit admission that, between 2014 and 2022, that hasn't happened for a variety of reasons, but it hasn't happened. And that there's this hope that from 2023, we'll see the same kind of surge that we saw in 2003 onwards. Um, Whether or not that will happen remains to be seen. But, can you know, look back at the budget and say, where is this strategy likely to work? This whole strategy from 2019 onwards that we've employed, that private sector will take the lead, government will push the capex, and will that work? Will that create jobs?
Okay. So we've been through a very prolonged period in which capex has been low, public sector capital formation has been very low, almost a decade where it has been, and of course it decelerated during recent years. I think the strategy of pushing capex at this stage is in itself a good strategy, right? Uh, and I think the government is right in focusing on the green economy, or the greens, green energy. It is right in also focusing our attention on industry 4.0 technologies and so on, right? So to that extent, and it is I think entirely conceivable that with the recovery now beginning to set in post can see it's entirely settled. It's conceivable that this will be able to drive and start a somewhat virtuous cycle and drive in private investment. So to that extent, frankly, I don't have any quarrels with the budget. I think these priorities are broadly correct. But what I would say from the job generation point of view, really, it's the equivalent of walking on two legs. If you want to create capex, if you want to drive in capital expenditure, are you doing enough to drive in investments which will create labor-intensive jobs? Are you investing enough in areas which will create good quality jobs? Have you invested in social security? Have you invested in the safety of workers? So, what are the other policy instruments or other expenditure instruments that you have used which can do all of that? Remember, at the moment, high skilled jobs are only about 15%, right? Requiring high cognitive skills and so on, only about 15% of the economy. 85% jobs are still in the so basically and of course a lot of these jobs are being created by very small units, informal sector units, tiny industries and so on. So the question to ask, the counter question to ask is, did the budget do enough to promote invest strategies, whether investment strategies or policies which can promote labor intensive growth and good quality employment in the economy? And there, I think it is following a conventional strategy. The conventional strategy is one of relying on fairly capital intensive growth. And that capital intensive growth is not going to give us enough jobs. It is not going to give us enough quality at the bottom of the pyramid. It is it will continue to foster high levels of inequality that is what we have seen for the past 30 odd years, with the growth in the formal sector, with growth in higher concentration of real wealth, concentration of real incomes, and so on and so forth. And I think some serious rethinking is needed by all of us on how can you reverse this trend.
Right, right. First of all, very grateful. Very big thanks to you for sparing your time and sharing with us your insights. And to the viewers, I would say that this is the first live session we've done. If you've enjoyed it and you found this a better format, please tell us, write to us, share your comments, and we'll try to do more of it. And if you like the series, we every week we do this a series where we talk to a top economist on something of current relevance. We've been doing it for a year. The playlist is there in the description. We'll keep it, and you can watch past episodes. And if you like it, every Friday, come to the YouTube channel of Indian Express and watch it. Like and subscribe and share it if you found value. And thanks for joining in today's session. And we'll see you next week on Friday. Thank you.
Udit, and thanks to all the participants for their questions. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot.